Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Mark pushed his plate away, the sound of metal on ceramic louder than it should have been. His appetite vanished in an instant. Across the table, Sophia watched him with that same eerie calm, like nothing had just shifted in their world. "I've been seeing someone else," she had said, the words sliding out as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. "But I think we can work through it. Maybe make things more interesting. I can handle both of you." For a moment, Mark thought he hadn't heard her correctly. The kitchen, with its soft morning light streaming in and the familiar smell of breakfast, suddenly felt like a foreign place. He looked at her, really looked at her. The woman he'd shared a life with, who now sat there sipping her coffee like it was just another Wednesday morning, was offering him a deal, as if infidelity could be smoothed over with a compromise. He clenched his fists under the table, the weight of her betrayal sinking in deeper with every second. The words "handle both of you" echoed in his head like a cruel joke. Mark stood up slowly, forcing calm into every motion. Without a glance, he walked away from the table and headed for the bedroom. His movements were deliberate, precise. He didn't need to argue, didn't need to yell. He was done. Sophia watched him, but there was no trace of fear or regret in her eyes, just a slight curiosity, as if she were waiting to see what he'd do next. She had no idea what she'd just destroyed. So Mark walked down the hall, his footsteps steady, each one deliberate, as if each step was erasing part of his life with Sophia. They entered the bedroom they had shared for years, the sight of it a strange mix of familiarity and betrayal. The bed was still unmade from the night before, the blankets tangled from where they had slept, or rather where he had slept beside her, completely unaware of the stranger who had already entered their marriage. He pulled the closet door open and grabbed one of her suitcases, yanking it off the top shelf with more force than necessary. The weight of it felt oddly satisfying in his hands. His fingers moved quickly, pulling open drawers, grabbing clothes without a second thought. He folded them roughly, tossing them into the suitcase without caring how they landed. Each piece of fabric felt like another reminder of the woman he thought he knew. As he packed, memories of their life together flashed through his mind: vacations, anniversaries, the quiet nights where they'd watch movies on this very bed, the laughter they used to share. How could it all have been so fake? He wondered if every moment, every smile had been a lie, if Sophia had always been capable of such betrayal, or if this was something new, some twisted evolution of her desires. But then came the anger, red hot and blistering. It surged through him as he shoved her favorite blouse into the suitcase. She had thrown their life away so easily, so carelessly, offering him a compromise that wasn't even meant to heal but to justify her selfishness. She hadn't even tried to hide it, hadn't begged for forgiveness. She hadn't been sorry. In fact, she had acted like she was doing him a favor. The audacity of it only fueled the fire growing inside him. As the suitcase filled, Sophia appeared in the doorway. Her arms crossed loosely, as if this was still some kind of conversation they were having, some moment they could turn around. "Mark," she started, her voice softer than before, but still too calm, too composed. There was no trace of remorse, only a hint of confusion in her eyes, like she couldn't quite believe he was actually packing her things. Mark didn't stop. He didn't even look at her. His hands kept moving, methodical, emptying the closet of every trace of her. In that moment, she became nothing more than a stranger to him, someone who had invaded his life and tried to negotiate her betrayal. He wouldn't give her that satisfaction. "Are you really doing this?" she asked, her tone more annoyed than hurt, as if she were the one being wronged. "It's not that serious, we could have both. It doesn't have to end like this." That was it. Mark's hands froze and he straightened up slowly, turning to finally meet her gaze. His eyes burned with an intensity she clearly hadn't expected. He took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm raging inside him, but the cold edge in his voice was undeniable when he spoke. "Get out, Sophia. You can have your new life, but you don't get to keep this one." She blinked, her mask of self-assurance cracking just slightly. He had never spoken to her like that before. But this wasn't the Mark she knew. This was someone else, someone who had been broken and was now rebuilding himself in the space of a single morning. Without waiting for her reply, he zipped the suitcase shut with a harsh finality and pushed it toward her. Sophia stood in the doorway, her arms still crossed, staring at the suitcase Mark had just shoved toward her. For a moment, she didn't move. It was as if she was processing the reality of the situation, the finality of his actions. Her confidence, which had been so apparent when she first made her twisted proposal, began to falter. Mark watched her, his chest tight with a strange mix of anger and calm. He had expected more tears, begging, some sign that she realized the weight of what she had done. But instead, Sophia just blinked, looking down at the suitcase, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before, but still with an edge of arrogance. "You're really going to throw this all away because of one mistake?" Just like that? She raised her chin, trying to regain her composure, but Mark could see the cracks in her facade. He shook his head, his voice cold. No, Sophia, you threw it away. I'm just cleaning up the mess. The words hit her like a slap. For the first time since this whole thing started, Mark saw something flicker in her eyes. A flash of realization, maybe, or just the sudden awareness that she had miscalculated. She had always thought she had the upper hand, that she could bend him to her like she had done so many times before. She took a step forward, her arms falling to her sides as if she were trying to close the distance between them, but Mark didn't budge. He didn't back away, but he didn't move toward her either. His stance was clear. There was nothing left to save here. Come on, Mark, she said, her voice softening, turning almost pleading. We can talk about this. You don't have to do something so drastic. It was just a mistake. I got carried away, but we can figure it out. You're really going to throw away everything we've built over this. The words twisted in his gut, but not in the way she intended. He felt no sympathy for her, no desire to soften. In fact, her attempts at reasoning only strengthened his resolve. She still didn't get it. She didn't understand what she had done. To her, this was just a minor misstep, something that could be talked over like any other disagreement. Mark's gaze hardened as he replied, You don't get it, do you? This isn't about one mistake. It's about everything you're willing to throw away for some stranger. You sat there at breakfast and tried to sell me a life where you could have him and me, as if I would agree to that. Like I'm just a piece of your twisted puzzle. Sophia's eyes widened, and her calm exterior began to unravel. It's not like that. Yes, it is, Mark interrupted, his voice firm. You've already made your choice. I'm just finishing it. He picked up the suitcase and carried it to the front door. When he opened it, the cold air rushed in, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension that had filled the house. Take your things and go, he said, standing by the door, his voice final. There was no more room for discussion, no more negotiations. It was over. And for the first time, real fear flashed in Sophia's eyes. This wasn't going according to her plan. But Mark didn't care anymore. He had made his decision, and there was no going back. Sophia stood at the threshold, her eyes darting from the suitcase at her feet to Mark's cold, unwavering expression. The fear in her eyes deepened, and for the first time, a crack appeared in the confident, manipulative mask she had been wearing since breakfast. The weight of the situation was sinking in, but Mark wasn't interested in her realization. It was too late for that. Mark, wait, she pleaded, her voice trembling now, the arrogance gone. She took a hesitant step forward, trying to reach for him, but he held up his hand, stopping her mid-step. Please, can we just talk about this? I didn't mean for things to go this far. Her desperation didn't move him. It was the same manipulation she had always used, the same soft voice she'd employed to smooth over their arguments or convince him to see things her way. But not this time. Mark could feel a distance between them that hadn't been there before, an emotional chasm that Sophia had created with her betrayal. We're past talking, Sophia, Mark said, his voice even but firm. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. You didn't just get carried away. You planned this, thought it through, and decided you could live with it. You didn't think about me, about us. You only thought about yourself. Sophia's eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape, for something she could say that would make him change his mind. Her lips trembled, and for a brief moment, she looked genuinely lost. She had always been the one in control, but now, as she stood before him, she realized she had no power left. I didn't want to lose you, she stammered, her voice cracking. I thought we could have something different. I didn't want to hurt you, Mark, I swear. Mark's laugh was sharp, bitter. Didn't want to hurt me. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. How could you possibly think that telling me you want to sleep with someone else and stay married wouldn't hurt me? Do you even hear yourself? She flinched at his words, but he didn't stop. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface now bubbled over, though he remained calm, his voice never rising above its controlled tone. You didn't just break our marriage, Sophia. You shattered the trust I had in you, the trust we spent years building. And you did it with a smile, like I should be grateful you even told me at all. Like it was some gift you were offering me. He shook his head, disgust curling in his stomach. Tears began to form in Sophia's eyes, but Mark wasn't swayed. He had spent years bending to her will, giving her the benefit of the doubt, believing in the version of her she had always shown him. But now, standing there with her suitcase by the door, the illusion was gone. She wasn't the woman he thought she was. Mark, please, she whispered, her voice barely audible now. Don't do this. Don't throw it all away. He clenched his jaw, the words hitting him like a final insult. You threw it away the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you. With that, he reached down, grabbed the suitcase, and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air hit his face, fresh and cool, a stark contrast to the heaviness inside. Sophia followed him to the door, her tears now falling freely, but he didn't look at her. He set the suitcase down beside her and turned back to the house. "Well, you should go," he said quietly, not turning to face her. "Whatever life you want, it's not here anymore." Sophia's sobs filled the air as Mark stepped back inside, shutting the door behind him. For the first time in years, the house felt peaceful, empty in a way that gave him a strange sense of relief. The door clicked shut behind Mark with a heavy finality, and for a moment, he just stood there, his hand still resting on the doorknob. He could hear Sophia's sobs through the thin wooden door, muffled but unmistakable, her desperation palpable even from inside. But he didn't feel moved by her tears. Not anymore. This wasn't about her feelings or her regret or her attempt to salvage the broken pieces of their life together. It was about something far deeper: his dignity, his self-respect. For so long, he had given in, compromised, and overlooked the small things that had chipped away at their marriage. Little lies, moments of manipulation that he had excused as part of the ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. But this was different. This was something he couldn't forgive, not because she had cheated, but because of the way she had tried to make him a part of it. The audacity to think he would share her. The thought made him sick. Mark stepped away from the door, his body moving on autopilot as he wandered back into the living room. Everything felt surreal now, the house strangely quiet, except for the distant sound of Sophia's cries outside. He stood in the center of the room, looking around at the space they had built together. The pictures on the walls, the furniture they had picked out, even the coffee mug on the table, everything felt like a relic from a life that no longer existed. A life that had been obliterated in the span of a single morning. He felt numb. There should have been anger or maybe even relief, but all he felt was a dull emptiness, like he was walking through the ruins of his own life, trying to make sense of the destruction. As he sank onto the couch, his eyes fell on a picture frame on the mantelpiece. It was a photo of the two of them from years ago, smiling on a beach vacation, arms around each other, carefree and happy. Mark couldn't remember the last time they had smiled like that. He couldn't even remember the last time they had truly been happy together. How had it come to this? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his head dropping into his hands. The weight of everything suddenly crashed down on him, harder than he had expected. He had ended it, pushed her out of their home, out of his life, but now the reality of that decision began to sink in. His marriage was over. The life they had shared, the future they had planned, was gone. He wasn't sure if it was the betrayal or the sheer loss of it all that hurt more. The sound of Sophia's footsteps retreating from the porch pulled him from his thoughts. She was leaving. Finally, he heard the car door open, close, the engine starting, and then the crunch of gravel as her car pulled away from the driveway. The moment felt both hollow and freeing, like a long overdue release. He stood up and walked to the window, watching as her car disappeared down the road. The tears, the pleading, it had all been part of her last-ditch effort to stay, to manipulate him once again. But he hadn't given in. He had stood his ground, and now, for the first time in years, he felt like he had control of his life again. But with that control came a crushing loneliness. Mark stared at the empty road for a long time, his thoughts a mess of contradictions. He had done the right thing. He knew that. But why did it feel like a part of him had been ripped away along with her? Why did the silence in the house feel so suffocating, so heavy when it should have been liberating? He closed his eyes, trying to breathe through the pain. It would pass, he told himself. This feeling, this emptiness, it would pass. Eventually. But for now, all he could do was stand there in the silence of the life he was starting over from scratch. The silence in the house was overwhelming. Mark stood by the window, staring at the empty road where Sophia had just driven away, the weight of her absence pressing down on him. The house had never felt this quiet before, and for a moment he wasn't sure what to do with himself. The adrenaline from the confrontation was starting to fade, leaving him feeling drained, exhausted. So he walked back to the couch and sat down heavily, leaning back and letting his eyes close for a moment. The familiar hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound now, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed his morning. He hadn't thought much about what came next. There had been no time for that. Everything had happened so fast: Sophia's confession, the decision to pack her things, the cold finality of showing her the door. Now that it was over, Mark felt like he was floating in some strange limbo, the weight of his choices sinking in slowly. The woman he had spent years with, built a life with was gone. It was what he wanted, what he needed, but it didn't make the ache in his chest any less real. He got up and moved around the house, his hands mindlessly straightening things, trying to fill the void with small tasks. He walked into the kitchen and noticed Sophia's coffee cup still sitting on the table, half empty, the lipstick stain on the rim a sharp reminder of how recently everything had changed. Without thinking, he picked it up and tossed it into the sink, the clatter loud in the quiet room. The small act of clearing it away felt strangely satisfying, like erasing the remnants of her from the space they had shared. He wandered into the bedroom next, standing in the doorway and staring at the bed. It was still unmade from the night before, the sheets twisted in a way that now felt unnatural, like the remnants of a life that didn't belong to him anymore. The room was filled with traces of her hairbrush on the dresser, the framed photo of the two of them on their wedding day. Mark walked over and picked it up, staring at the picture of them smiling, lost in a time when everything had felt simple and right. It felt like it belonged to someone else, some other version of him who had been blissfully unaware of what would come later. Without hesitation, he placed the photo face down on the dresser. It wasn't anger that drove him, it was a need to distance himself from the memories that no longer held any value. He couldn't keep looking at the life they had built and pretend it was still intact. So the reality was, it had been broken for a long time. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair as he looked around. He felt the creeping loneliness again, but this time it was accompanied by something else: clarity. The haze of betrayal that had clouded his mind was lifting, and in its place was a resolve, a determination to move forward. This house, this space it would be his now, he would take it back. He had lost enough of himself to Sophia's lies, and now it was time to reclaim his life, piece by piece. He wasn't sure how long it would take or how hard it would be, but for the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he had a future that didn't include her. He stood up, a new sense of purpose settling over him. It wouldn't be easy. The wounds were fresh, the scars would take time to heal, but he was ready to start rebuilding, no matter how long it took. Well, Mark spent the next few days in a haze of quiet routine. The house, once filled with the comfortable noise of shared life, now felt like a foreign space. He tried to fill his time with small tasks: cleaning, organizing, throwing out things that reminded him of Sophia. Every item he touched seemed to hold a memory, some small fragment of the life they had built together, but it was all tainted now. There was no nostalgia, only a bitter aftertaste. The first night after she left had been the hardest. Lying in the bed alone, the emptiness next to him felt enormous, suffocating. He had stared at the ceiling for hours, his thoughts a whirl of anger, sadness, and confusion. The silence in the house was deafening, the lack of her presence more powerful than he had expected. So by the second night, he found some peace in the solitude. Slowly, the house began to feel more like his again. He had avoided thinking too much about Sophia or where she was. He didn't want to imagine her with that other man, didn't want to picture her moving on so easily from the destruction she had caused. But the thoughts crept in anyway, late at night when the quiet became too much. Mark would sit in the living room, staring at nothing, and wonder if she was feeling the same loss he was, or if she was already wrapped up in her new life, leaving him behind without a second thought. One morning, a few days after she had left, he decided it was time to clear out the bedroom. It had been on his mind since the moment she walked out the door. He couldn't keep living among her things, couldn't keep waking up every day to the reminders of a life that no longer existed. So he started small, taking her clothes out of the closet, one hanger at a time, folding each piece neatly and setting it aside. As he worked, a strange sense of calm washed over him. There was something therapeutic about it, removing her presence from the house, reclaiming the space as his own. Each empty hanger felt like a step forward, like he was shedding the weight of the betrayal she had left behind. He paused when he found a small box tucked into the back of the closet. It was one of those memory boxes, the kind people keep to store old letters, photos, and keepsakes. He hadn't seen it in years, and for a moment, he hesitated. Did he really want to open it? Did he want to dig through more reminders of their past, knowing what he would find? But something pushed him forward. Mark sat down on the bed, placed the box on his lap, and slowly opened the lid. Inside were letters they had written to each other early in their relationship, back when things had been fresh and full of promise. There were postcards from vacations, photos of the two of them in happier times, smiling, carefree. He sifted through the contents, each item a painful reminder of what they had once been. But as he went through it, he realized something. Those memories, those moments belonged to him too. They weren't just hers. Sophia had betrayed him, had shattered their marriage, but she couldn't erase the past. The good times, the love they had shared, it was real, even if it was over now. Mark closed the box and set it aside. He wasn't going to dwell on what was lost anymore. He had his memories, and that was enough. But it was time to start building new ones. Alone. A check-see. As he stood up, he felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The house, though still quiet, no longer felt like a tomb of his past. It was becoming his home again, a place where he could move forward, one day at a time. By the time Mark reached the final day of clearing out the house, it no longer felt like a painful chore. It felt more like a necessary rebirth. The rooms had transformed from shared spaces into something distinctly his own. Sophia's things were gone, the last reminders of her packed away into boxes that he planned to drop off at her sister's house. and with each item he removed, the air in the house felt lighter. Standing in the now empty bedroom, he realized that for the first time since she left, he wasn't thinking about Sophia. He wasn't wondering where she was or who she was with. He wasn't imagining her in the arms of that stranger or replaying her cold confession at breakfast. Instead, he was thinking about himself, about the quiet that had once been suffocating, but now felt like freedom. Mark opened the windows, letting in the cool afternoon breeze. The house breathed with him, fresh air circulating through the rooms, pushing out the stale remnants of their past life. He glanced around the bedroom, now stripped of anything that had belonged to her. The bed was neatly made, the closet nearly empty, and yet the emptiness no longer felt like a loss. It was potential. It was possibility. There was a knock at the door, startling him from his thoughts. For a moment, his heart clenched, a small, irrational part of him wondering if Sophia had come back, if she had realized her mistake and was there to beg for forgiveness. But as he walked to the door, he dismissed the thought. Sophia wasn't coming back. She had made her choice, and so had he. Opening the door, Mark was surprised to see his neighbor Carol standing there. She was holding a casserole dish, her face a mixture of concern and kindness. "Hey, Mark," she said, offering a soft smile. "I figured you might need something to get to eat. I've seen you running back and forth with boxes all week. Thought I'd bring you something so you don't have to worry about cooking." Mark blinked, momentarily stunned by the gesture. He and Carol had always been on friendly terms, exchanging casual pleasantries over the years, but he hadn't expected this. He hadn't even realized she had noticed what was going on. "That's really kind of you," he said, taking the dish from her. "Thank you." Carol leaned against the door frame, studying him for a moment. "I saw that Sophia's car hasn't been around lately," she said gently, not prying, but giving him space to explain if he wanted to. Mark sighed, setting the dish down on the kitchen counter. He wasn't sure if he was ready to get into the details of his marital collapse, but he also didn't feel the need to hide it anymore. "She's gone," he said simply, turning to face Carol. "It's over." Carol's expression softened and she nodded. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, "but I'm not going to say I'm staying." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Carol hesitated, glancing down at her hands before meeting his gaze again. "It's none of my business, but I've seen the way she treated you, Mark, and you've always deserved better. I didn't want to overstep, but I'm sorry you had to go through that." Her words struck him more than he expected. He'd been so wrapped up in his own pain, in the betrayal, that he hadn't considered how their relationship looked from the outside. Had other people noticed too? Had they seen the subtle manipulation, the way Sophia had always seemed to take more than she gave? Mark didn't know what to say. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of validation, like maybe he hadn't imagined it all. Maybe he wasn't overreacting by ending things so abruptly. "Thanks, Carol," he said finally, offering her a genuine smile. "I appreciate that." She smiled back, a little wider this time. "You're a good guy, Mark. If you ever need anything or just someone to talk to, you know where to find me." With that, she waved and turned to head back to her house, leaving him alone again in the doorway. But this time, the loneliness didn't feel quite as overwhelming. Mark closed the door and returned to the kitchen, staring at the casserole dish for a moment before deciding to heat it up for dinner. As the oven preheated, he wandered into the living room, noticing the way the late afternoon light spilled through the windows. The house felt different now, lighter, more peaceful. It was his again. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could sit down and breathe without feeling like he was drowning in memories of Sophia and the life they had once shared. As he sat on the couch, letting the quiet settle around him, this time the silence didn't press in on him like a weight. It was comforting, a reminder that he had survived the worst of it. The betrayal, the anger, the heartbreak, it was all behind him now. There was a long road ahead, he knew that. But for the first time, Mark felt like he had a future that was his own. He didn't need to hold on to the past, didn't need to wonder what went wrong. He had done what he needed to do. He had let her go. And now, in the quiet of his empty home, Mark felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was there. A small flicker, a sense that things might get better, that life might rebuild itself in ways he hadn't imagined yet. For the first time, he looked forward to it.